Get in, normie. We're gonna save Western civilization. Or are we? What happens when a controversial political YouTuber...
It is not acceptable to call me a...
You know what? Fair enough. You can't change that you're a... and it's not very nice for me to call you a... I won't do it.
or call yourself or your friends.
Whoa, 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 whoa. What are you talking about? What are you talking about?
Transitions into real-life politics.
You have a video where you call Chinese people chicks. It's broadly accepted as a racist term.
Yeah, I know. That's why I used that.
To find out, we have to learn about Sargon of Akkad. Real name Carl Benjamin. Little is known about his life before his YouTube fame besides the fact that he started a game dev company with a friend of his in mid-2012 called Otherworld Software, something he'd been working on for about a year already. You see, Carl's original objective was to become a game developer, and the company had already made a few small games. His YouTube account, Sargon of Akkad 100, was created in 2010 and was completely inactive up until June 2013, when, after years of slow-burning online conflict between feminists and the skeptic and gamer communities, he released a critique of a video released by the then popular feminist figure Anita Sarkeesian. The video was the first of many, and while they weren't instantly successful, they slowly established Sargon as another member of the skeptic community, which would soon become the breeding ground for the early anti-SJW movement. Still, at the time, he was far from a full-fledged political commentator, and often made videos that had nothing to do with those topics, as his main goal continued to be game development. In early 2014, Sargon created a Kickstarter page for the game he was making called Necromancer, which he promoted on his main channel. The project raised £8,000 in under 1 month and promptly released a playable demo. However, within a month of this release, Sargon's channel had already grown to over 3,000 subs, which was surprising since he hadn't put that much effort toward it. With the small bit of experience with crowdfunding from his game dev endeavors, he set up a Patreon for himself, which I suspect makes him one of the earliest adopters of that content creator business model. For context, Patreon was created less than 1 year before Sargon made his page. As early as July, he was already getting a little bit of money on it, a sign that there was a demand for the kind of content he was making. However, making individual videos on each topic he wanted to cover wasn't very efficient, so instead, he started doing a series called This Week in Stupid, a kind of equals 3 equivalent, but for topics he was interested in. Sargon was quickly earning a name for himself in the anti-feminist sphere because, while other YouTubers from the early 2010s occasionally broached that topic, none were primarily focused on it, meaning he could tap into that market. He had already made a few videos that got hundreds of thousands of views, but things ramped up once he made his first ever Gamergate video. If you don't know what Gamergate was, believe me, you're witnessing its consequences to this day. Basically, a video game developer by the name of Zoe Quinn was accused by her ex-boyfriend of sleeping with video game journalists for positive reviews, including one Nathan Grayson who had positively covered Zoe's works. This relatively minor controversy spiraled into a debate about ethics in video game journalism. At least, that's the perspective of one side of the conflict. The other side, which was backed and represented by the main gaming news outlets, framed it as misogynist gatekeeping women out of gaming. This conflict became #Gamergate, which coincided, if not kicked off, the anti-social justice warrior movement as we know it. Sargon was already months into criticizing Anita Sarkeesian by the time Gamergate took off, and once she became extremely infamous for her relation to the movement, Sargon reaped its benefits. He began uploading videos almost daily and became such a prominent face of Gamergate that he was the one who got interviewed when BBC Radio covered it. However, BBC only played a fraction of their conversation, which prompted Sargon to upload the original, unedited interview in full on his channel. In it, he challenged the notion that Gamergate was a harassment campaign against women in gaming, something that many journalists had suggested. The fact that the BBC edited this specific part out certainly gave the impression that that's the narrative the media wanted to preserve, and Sargon's objection to it was very appealing to his audience. By January of 2015, he had over 50,000 subscribers. While he avoided talking about his personal life, he began a relationship with the person he eventually married and had kids with. He became one of the de facto leaders of the skeptic community and often collaborated with other content creators who were a part of the same sphere. But however relevant all of this was online, it didn't translate into real-world politics that much. But everything changed when Donald Trump announced his candidacy in June 2015, an event that instantly became reviled by journalists and celebrated by all people who hated journalists, which happened to include Gamergaters and, consequently, Sargon himself. As political commentators like Milo Yiannopoulos and Ben Shapiro skyrocketed in popularity due to how gigantic libtards getting owned compilations became, Sargon was one of the ships that got lifted by that rising tide. He'd already been making making fun of Tumblerinas for 2 years at that point, and suddenly all of his content backlog started getting traction. Throughout 2015, he was growing a lot, and he got up to 200,000 subscribers, and I guess due to his content having gotten so political, he must have thought it was a good idea to start participating in debates. The only problem with that being that just because you're a good YouTuber doesn't mean you're a good debater. His first attempt at it was against leftist journalist Michael Brooks, who simply and repeatedly tried to get him to define what the term regressive left meant, a task that Sargon really struggled to do since he was used to just saying that term to his audience and having them connect the dots on what he was trying to articulate. The debate turned into a one-sided confrontation, with Michael Brooks on the offensive and Sargon seemingly doing his best to dodge and change the subject. His performance was so bad that some of his fans came out against him, trying to coach him into debating people better. Maybe he should have taken them up on that offer, since about a month later, he debated yet another public figure, Christy Winters, one of the few prominent feminist people who stuck around in the atheist community after the anti-SJW wave started. He also performed quite poorly in this debate, to the point where he recognized as much in the after-debate video. Regardless of these hiccups, he continued to grow steadily, and around the time this debate took place, he was making $1,000 per upload off of Patreon. While he'd mostly been covering political developments in the US, by mid-2016, the same kind of controversies made their way across the pond as the Brexit movement took off. In a nutshell, Brexit was the proposal for Britain to leave the European Union, something Sargon extensively covered and supported. And from that point onward, Sargon's primary focus was getting people to vote yes on it. Whatever aspirations he'd had regarding different kinds of content went completely out the window, including his game Necromancer, which was canceled and refunded to everyone who donated to his Kickstarter. He was now not only being an online influence on American politics, but actively participating in his own country's political process. However, while he was paying attention to domestic affairs, they weren't really the right kind, since on July 3rd, during one of Sargon's many streams, he inadvertently shows a Facebook message he'd just received from his wife, saying, "Question, why can't you help yourself when it comes to flirting with women? Just a couple of days after the whole Booth thing, you messaged a f***ing transgender telling them how good looking they are. What the f*** is your problem? Clearly cannot trust you." This stream is still up on YouTube for whatever reason. Sargon never even went through the trouble of cutting that part out with the YouTube editor. I have no idea who this transgender person is or what the Booth thing is supposed to be, but none of this sounds particularly kosher. Fortunately for him, this moment went by mostly unnoticed, to the point where I'd safely guess most people who know him have no idea this ever happened. And honestly, it's not that big of a deal. It's just like, why? As the American elections approached, Sargon was doing his best to simultaneously cover Brexit and turn his pro-Trump content up a notch, capitalizing on the massive media phenomenon it was at the time. When Trump won, Sargon celebrated by ironically posting a compilation of clips of Akilah Obviously, a Hillary-supporting online personality, to mock her. We're gonna come back to this later. 2017 started off on the wrong foot. Sargon got suspended from Twitter for unspecified reasons. Soon after, when he tried using his secondary account, he quickly found out it was also suspended, also for reasons not made immediately clear. Eventually, in a stream, he revealed that, while his main account status was still unexplained, his alt got suspended because he DM'd clips of two men being extremely affectionate with one another to someone who was pretending to be him on Twitter. Sargon's explanation was that, in one of the replies this person made, they claimed the images didn't bother him since he actually loved the male apparatus. Eventually, Twitter lifted his suspension, and he returned to Twitter without issue, which is important because Twitter was the catalyst for the next development in his career. In January of 2017, he noticed that the British government had very loose criteria for what constituted an ethnicity and suggested he'd register posters as an ethnicity, which was promptly identified with the Kekistani nationality. For context, Kek initially came about as what the text filter in World of Warcraft produced when a player with a horde character typed out LOL, which is also how Koreans type out laughter. It was casually adopted by 4chan users until, in the lead up to the 2016 election, people discovered it was the name of the Egyptian deity of primordial darkness, which had the head of a frog. This, in turn, was instantly associated with Pepe the Frog, who at the time was being framed as a symbol of the alt-right, and it was embraced as such by some 4chan users. When a post happened to get repeating numbers in a signature code, Kek would be praised, and the concept of meme magic got brought up as something that could manifest Trump's presidency into reality. All in all, it's just a massive internal joke that spiraled into something much larger than initially intended, but it became a reliable identifier of who was in the know. This immediately became one of Sargon's main gimmicks and played a significant role in transforming an internal poll meme with little to no relevance outside of 4chan into a huge phenomenon. Soon after, the hashtag #FreeKekistan started going viral on Twitter, with other political commentators engaging with it, and even some mainstream media articles written about it. It's important to say that the epic "He Will Not Divide Us" stream started just just 10 days before these tweets from Sargon, so Shia LaBeouf had made the perfect storm. Throughout 2017, Kekistan got a national anthem, and perhaps most importantly, elected the illustrious Big Man Tyrone as its representative. Admittedly, the hype died down pretty hard in the following years as people on 4chan became dissatisfied with how watered down and normified Kekistan became. Still, while it was at its peak of popularity, Sargon was at its helm. However, not all things were positive, even during the so-called good times. The skeptic community, which was still something near and dear to Sargon at the time, found itself embroiled in one controversy after another. For starters, about a year prior began the Candid controversy, in which some of Sargon's associates, mainly Armored Skeptic and Shoe1Head, got into hot water for promoting an app called Candid, marketed as a kind of early alt-tech platform for the anonymous discussion of controversial topics. The only problem is, unbeknownst to their audiences, and apparently even to the content creators promoting it, the marketing was completely contrary to what the app actually did. Not only did the app allegedly collect and sell your data, which, despite sounding spooky, is just par for the course as far as apps go, and probably 100% of the apps you have do that, but it also wasn't really a free speech app since it did have moderation done by an AI to prevent slander and hate speech, which had the potential of being even more censorship friendly than regular means of communication since the AI relied on user input and reports to ban people, something that could easily be abused and manipulated. Most of this was brought to people's attention by a YouTuber called Harmful Opinions, who spoke out about it multiple times and eventually discussed it on a live stream with Sargon. It didn't go too well since Harmful was characterized as someone gratuitously purity testing the skeptic community, which from his perspective wasn't the case. Overall, Harmful had the opinion that the skeptics swept the Candid can of worms under the rug as hard as possible, with relative success since none of them lost their credibility as a consequence. Harmful Opinions saw it as a classic case of people getting paid to not look under the hood and promote something blindly, then avoiding accountability when called out on it. Sargon's point at least seemed to be that being as confrontational as Harmful was would lead to a fracture in the community, and they needed to stick together. Even if he was being completely sincere, Sargon's wishes for a united skeptic community wouldn't materialize since in 2017, another founding member of the skeptic community, Thunderfoot, decided to announce his departure. According to him, the anti-SJW movement was becoming a parody of itself, citing one specific instance of Sargon, among other skeptics, making fun of an incident in which one of the members of the channel, The Skeptic Feminist, shot and killed a woman.
Well, a feminist got triggered. For the final time. But I want to say, can I praise the shooter really quick?
Most of Thunderfoot's video was directed at Sargon since he was one of the biggest voices associated with it, and soon after, Sargon replied with a video titled, "Never Outshine the Master." In it, he accuses Thunderfoot of deliberately misrepresenting the point of his stream, providing more stream highlights to prove his point, including times when he had a more sober discussion about the shooter. While the audience mostly accepted Sargon's explanation, Thunderfoot did not, and doubled down with another video 2 days later, mostly reiterating what had already been said. Sargon came out with another video countering Thunderfoot the same day. This was basically the skeptic community's Kendrick Lamar versus Drake. They continued to go back and forth fruitlessly for a little while until Sargon bowed out, seeing that most people had sided with him in the conflict and saw what he said in the first stream as a joke in poor taste and nothing else. As far as public spats went, this was the first one he could confidently say he won, meaning he was batting 1-3. But VidCon was coming up, and Sargon had the brilliant idea of playing to his strengths and poking a little bit of fun at Anita Sarkeesian, only this time it would be in real life. During a panel of hers about cyberbullying, Sargon decided to occupy front row seats so that she could see him, and she reacted as you would expect.
You're making these dumb videos that just say the same over and over again. And like, I hate to give you attention because you're a garbage human. Whatever.
As much as they made fun of her, being publicly acknowledged by Anita, and even better, having her do so while evidently angry, meant they stood to get a lot more clout. It was around this point in time that the commentary community was also thriving, and many channels inherited the skeptics' crusade against feminists. Many people, Sargon included, addressed the situation and called on Hank and John Green, who had organized the event, to punish Anita for technically attacking an audience member. However, the Green brothers confirmed she would face no consequences whatsoever. This made people pretty mad, but not as much as when Boogie posted a video retelling his experience with Anita at VidCon, in which he claimed that, after a panel both of them participated in ended, she took him aside and berated him for having a closing statement that put feminists and skeptics on equal grounds of legitimacy.
I don't remember exactly what she said, I'm paraphrasing here, but she said in a very upset that I think it was very uncool that you said what you said there at the end, knowing that no one else would have enough time to respond. I bet you can imagine how that affected my anxiety, because the exact focal point of my anxiety for the entire weekend, in fact for the last last 6 weeks, the nightmare scenario that I was terrified of actually had come true. I'd upset somebody who I very, very much had tried to not upset and did not want to upset.
While it may seem unthinkable nowadays, during this time, Boogie had a reputation as the Mr. Rogers of YouTube, which made people extra infuriated against Anita. This was a massive win for Sargon, since after half a decade of antagonizing her, the general public had come to his side. Sargon eventually talked about the situation on the Joe Rogan Experience, and though it's true that at the time it was relatively easier to get on there, it still meant an amount of prestige that had been afforded to very few people, especially YouTubers. On the topic of Anita Sarkeesian, this meant total Sargon victory. However, things took a turn for the worse when, about 2 months later, Akilah obviously happened upon that one compilation Sargon posted in the wake of Trump's victory and proceeded to take the video down for copyright. When Sargon disputed the takedown, Akilah sued him. Tensions around the topic of copyright reform were already high, since the Ethan Klein versus Matt Haas case had just happened, in which Matt sued Ethan for reacting to his videos. While many creators covered this, Sargon remained pretty quiet on the topic, probably because his lawyer advised him to do so. Due to international ramifications, since Sargon was in the UK and Akilah was in the US, this case didn't look so great from the get-go. But we'll come back to this topic later. In early October, he took part in a debate at MythCon 2017 against a certain male feminist called Thomas Smith, and finally, Sargon evened his score. For context, a good chunk of this debate is centered around a tweet that Sargon made, tagging the then British MP Jess Phillips, saying that he wouldn't even her. His audience thought this was hilarious and began replicating Sargon's tweet, which was spun by the media as 600 threats. However, in Sargon's words, all 600 were exactly the opposite, saying specifically that they wouldn't do it. Sargon was eventually confronted about it, prompting him to double down and say, "There's been an awful lot of talk about whether I would or wouldn't go gorilla mode on Jess Phillips. I suppose with enough pressure, I might cave, but let's be honest, nobody's got that much beer." Thomas mistakenly assumed that bringing this up during the debate would put Sargon on the defense, a position he's known to not be good at fighting from, but instead the exact opposite happened.
You saw fit to tweet at her, to say to her, "I wouldn't even you."
Yep. And do you understand why your moral outrage about that is something I just don't care about?
It turns out taking this stance wasn't a great strategy, as it made the entire audience turn against Thomas. One less known part of this story is that after the debate, one of Thomas's friends decided to engage with Sargon about this yet again after the event was done, yielding similar results, or lack thereof. This winning streak pumped up Sargon's ego a bit. He was like, "Hey, I'm good at debates," only for him to find himself on Andy Worski's podcast debating none other than the white nationalist Richard Spencer. Yeah, the guy that got punched. This is a stupid position to find yourself in the first place, because if you beat a guy like that in a debate, it's not like you get hailed for it, since he's such a hated figure in the first place. But if you lose, you make him, and consequently his position, look kind of good. The debate lasted a whopping 4 hours, during which Sargon often resorted to being hostile and snarky, while Spencer put on an air of professionalism and amicability and spoke as articulately as he could, resulting in a lot of people saying that Spencer won, despite his position being pretty hard to defend.
Sargon, I am
not
going to say something that might be the most insulting thing we've ever heard.
I will accept your apology whenever you're ready to give it.
You think that you are more intelligent than you are, and that's actually a really tricky place to be.
One of Sargon's longtime objectives, and part of why he frequently engaged in slap fights with alt-right people in the first place, was because he wanted to set himself apart from far-right ideologies. Soon after the Spencer debate, he posted a video in which he reflected on it and revealed his intention to turn his up until then exclusively online platform into a real-life political movement. He was made fun of for this, but didn't relent, and proceeded to register a website for his activist group, The Liberalists, supposed to represent the principles of British classic liberalism. The whole platform quickly fell apart, as only 2 streams were ever made pushing for it before Sargon himself discontinued it, even if not officially. However, this wasn't the end of his political aspirations. Later on in 2018, Sargon followed his friend Count Dankula's lead and joined the United Kingdom Independence Party, or UKIP for short. While it was a very small party for most of its existence, Brexit catapulted it into prominence. Though after that same referendum that Sargon was promoting was successful, it started losing steam. That is, until British online personalities began joining. Sargon, Count Dankula, Paul Joseph Watson, and others were now actively promoting the party on their YouTube channels, causing the party membership to grow by 500 people. Their entry into UKIP coincided with the controversial Articles 11 and 13, which were EU propositions to put more pressure on social media platforms to prevent copyright violations, with more supervision over everything users upload, which which could mean a whole host of different but equally ominous interpretations of the law that don't favor YouTubers. This should have been a relatively easy fight to pick since many people were reasonably afraid of what could happen if those propositions passed. However, when the time came to do a conference regarding these topics, virtually no one showed up to watch them speak. Despite this, Sargon felt that he'd been legitimized as a political figure, and what did he do next? Hash out some grudges with people he'd beefed with online. You can leave YouTube drama, but YouTube drama doesn't leave you. Specifically, he went after Jim Medicare, who had been one of the many people who mocked and put down his original liberalist movement concept, among other smaller bits of conflict that ultimately led to a planned live stream of Sargon's called Hello Jim. The thing is, this stream was announced a few days in advance, allowing Jim to plan ahead so he could react to it live. In a clever move, Sargon started the stream a few hours ahead of schedule, when it would be early morning in the UK, but the middle of the night for Jim, meaning he wouldn't be able to catch it while it was still on. In a not so clever move by Sargon, he left the chat off and forgot his microphone was muted for the first 20 minutes of the stream. Just talking away at the void. Following this up with even more stupidity, once his mic was on, Sargon went on a rant about Medicare being an all-around bad person based on things he saw on 4chan and Kiwi Farms. The low light of this stream was when Sargon suggested Jim was a groomer based on a low-quality audio recording of him talking to a 17-year-old who was dating a 14-year-old. If this sounds like a nothing burger, it's because it pretty much is, and Sargon made himself look like a fool even to his own audience. Additionally, he accused Medicare of lying about suffering from autoimmune disease and cancer in order to get sympathy donations on Patreon, again, based purely on speculation. The stream ended up getting massively dislike bombed as people sided with Medicare before he'd even made a response to Sargon's stream, mostly because of how flimsy Sargon's evidence was. When Mr. Medicare did go live, despite taking their beef a lot less seriously than Sargon did, and spending the majority of time simply making fun of him, he had an easy time defending himself from the accusations. The recorded conversation Sargon used to accuse Jim of being a groomer, for example.
Yeah, geez, Sargon, it makes you think, why would Jim be talking to this guy about dating an underage boy across state lines? Maybe it's because we had a sneaking suspicion that our 17-year-old was actually 19 years old and that he was bragging about having nude pics of underage boys on his fucking cell phone. And maybe the reason the call is recorded, you unbelievably dumb motherfucker, is because we were going to with him, get it on as evidence, and then send it to his fucking family.
This certainly made more sense than whatever Sargon was trying to imply, and the fact that this pretty serious claim was made without any rigor on the part of Sargon severely damaged his reputation. Whereas Sargon was previously seen as someone who argues in good faith, even if he occasionally fumbles a debate or gets a little high and mighty, people were now seeing he could be petty and dishonest, even actively malicious. While this didn't hurt his prospects in his political career per se, it showed that despite the more professional direction Sargon was going, he retained the reckless behavior of a YouTuber. For example, he continued to engage with the Killstream, one of the main hubs of terminally online miscreants and alt-right lolcows, including its owner, Ethan Ralph, who became notorious online for, among many other things, being convicted of distributing revenge porn of the woman who had become the mother of his child. Not exactly the kind of company an aspiring politician should be keeping, to say the least. However, it wasn't his direct involvement that became an issue, but the possibility he'd been trying to get it taken down. It's hard to explain Sargon's relationship with the so-called alt-right, since, while he frequently antagonized them openly, which is far from impressive since it's completely okay to dunk on those guys, he also seemed to want their approval and engage with them much more than necessary. For context, in late 2018, the Killstream raised almost $30 grand for charity, only for the funds to get held by YouTube, followed by the Killstream getting taken off the platform. This is directly related to an article in the Wall Street Journal about how far-right personalities on the platform flew under the radar of TOS violations by having these super chats say crazy stuff instead of saying it themselves. And the writer of that article had reached out to Ralph and let him know his streams were going to be used as an example. His fans did not take this lightly, as they started spamming the journalist in question with mean tweets, resulting in her privating her account. Ralph tried to do the Killstream through the channel of one of his regulars, Zidane, but that was also taken down. The next day, all of his associated channels were removed, and Ralph had to move his operation to stream.me. This attracted a lot of backlash, since it looked like journalists were trying to stop alt-right people from doing charity in fear it would make them look better. Soon after, the hashtag Wall Street Journal kids started making rounds on Twitter, and it's at this point that Sargon comes in. Shortly after Ethan had been banned, people speculated Sargon had used one of his dummy accounts to post an inflammatory tweet mocking Ralph getting banned and suggesting that one of his associates, Andy Worski, should suffer the same punishment. Some people even expressed their suspicions that Sargon actually had something to do with the ban itself, with a particular focus on one of his associates who went by the name of Kraut. Kraut was exposed for having a Discord server in which he hosted doxes of far-right people, so it wasn't too far-fetched of a theory, even if it wasn't really supported by anything. To settle this, Sargon gets invited to the kill stream, and during it, more tweets from this alt account get shown that further establish that Sargon had it in for the kill stream and wanted the eyes of advertisers on it.
What is that tweet about?
Can you not figure that out?
Sargon does qualify that his objective in bringing it up was to get ads taken off of Twitter, whatever that means. Not to take them off the air, but still, it didn't bode well for him. Still, he insisted he had nothing to do with it. When the topic of Kraut's doxing came up, Sargon became pretty vague about his degree of awareness as to what Kraut was up to, but he maintained that he consistently told him it wasn't worth it to go gyat for gyat, riz for riz with alt-righters, advising him not to do bad things, whatever they may be.
Look, I told you, I didn't know what Kraut was doing on his server because I never went on his server. I became under the impression that he was doing bad things, so I was like, Kraut, if you're doing bad things, don't do bad things. And then this whole fucking shitstorm happens. It turns out Kraut didn't really do anything. So now, I mean, like, a lot of you guys owe Kraut an apology. I mean, you understand that, right?
They showed a post of his in which he expressed he personally didn't care if Jim or Ralph suffered these attacks since he disliked them, but there's not much proof beyond that Sargon had any hand in the actual bannings. While Sargon managed to defend himself, later on in the stream, he reiterated his baseless belief that Jim was a groomer, and overall, this debate, if we can even call it that, wasn't won by any side. Sargon wasn't satisfied though. He needed another L to close off the year. He asked to take part in a stream with Christy Winters to discuss the 2018 midterm elections. A pattern you might be picking up on is that Sargon doesn't really ever let go of grudges, and he struggles to move past things, especially when it involves him losing some kind of competition. About 2 years after his debate with Christy, they go at it again, and once again, Sargon is simply unprepared, unable to provide specific answers and telling Christy to Google it when confronted. Not that debates are super important, but Sargon asked to get on the stream, so it doesn't really make sense that he wouldn't be prepared for it. Eventually, the stream just evolved into Christy and her co-host Kevin making fun of him for his uninformed chudness. Despite all of the hiccups and embarrassment he'd put himself through, he continued to grow steadily. At this point, his Patreon was raking in over 12 grand a month. However, that came to an abrupt end when, on December 6, his page was taken down for, quote, using racist language. Comically enough, in his video about the situation, Sargon showed that the specific violation he got kicked off of the platform for was when he referred to alt-right people as white N-words. Patreon's decision was very controversial, so much so that even mainstream voices like Sam Harris decided to close their account in protest of what happened. The main issue here was that Sargon had said what he said outside of Patreon, and the TOS is only supposed to apply to content behind the paywall. In an odd instance of deja vu, a few weeks after the fact, Sargon blamed Ethan Ralph for the whole thing, accusing him of running a false flagging campaign out of his Discord server. Ralph responded by saying that the Discord server Sargon was talking about had been dead and buried at that point and couldn't possibly have been the culprit. Ultimately, since the ban wasn't due to any particular piece of content behind the paywall, it's much more likely that they just made up an excuse to go and kick Sargon out for being too right-wing. Given Patreon's behavior toward other right-wing personalities around the same time, it wouldn't be too surprising. Still, as terrible as it is getting 12,000 less every month, Sargon had a lot on his plate. The next person to be included in the UKIP roster was Tommy Robinson, who had been convicted of interfering with a trial by recording a member of a Muslim gang who had been convicted of rape and was sentenced to a measly 12 years. For doing this, he was branded a far-right agitator and spent 13 months in prison. So his addition to UKIP certainly attracted attention. UKIP was now full of controversial online personalities, unfortunately causing one of its senior members, Nigel Farage, to distance himself. But due to how many people joined the party as a consequence of that strategy, it was hard to see how this could be a bad thing. This began to change as Sargon's reputation soured, a souring which accelerated once a certain remark towards a British MP named Jess Phillips that I mentioned here previously resurfaced, resulting in this absolutely fire moment during a press conference.
I would like to ask Carl Benjamin why you think it is acceptable to say on Twitter that you wouldn't even a female Labour MP.
Because I don't think women are any different to men in the way that we should treat them. Unlike the establishment, unlike our judges who literally say if you were a man, I would have sent you to jail, I think we should treat women the same as men. And that means if a woman is being a giant and laughing at males, I'm going to be a giant back to her. Any questions?
So it's acceptable?
Yes!
It is acceptable to joke about raping a woman.
100%. Deal with it.
But this was just the tip of the iceberg. More clips resurfaced, one in which Sargon makes what many saw as controversial remarks about the age of consent.
I was well under the age of 11 when I started having sex, and so what I like to do is put people on the other side of the argument. It's like, what you have to do is you have to say that someone like me, not anybody else but me, that I was too stupid to appreciate the nature and quality of what I was doing at the time. But please convince me I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah, I think I think it depends on the child, really, doesn't it?
I suspect he started becoming a little self-aware about how this whole conversation was sounding. Following a discussion about sexual customs in ancient Rome involving minors, Sargon cracked a joke about it.
So I can be quoted saying, "You can f young boys."
Unsurprisingly, the media picked it up and ran with it. In all fairness, you're kind of asking for it when you say things like, "It depends on the child." Even out of context, it's very easy for the media to paint that a certain way, especially considering the spotty track record that some other online personalities from this period had with the same topic. This is especially ironic considering his attempted smear of Jim with an equally dishonest approach. But regardless, it doesn't make the media coverage of Sargon putting his foot in his mouth any better. They actually went as far as to make a Frankenstein out of multiple completely unrelated quotes, including one he made in entirely other streams.
It's actually not as controversial as you think. For example, I think in the Netherlands, the age of consent is something like 12 or 14. It's actually surprisingly young to Western, to sort of like, English speaking sensibilities. The thing is, this is actually something that's happened many times in human history. Like the ancient Greeks practiced pederasty, and it was considered completely normal, where young boys would have relationships.
Sargon defended himself pretty well, doing his best to clarify the misleading parts of the article, but he'd already cemented himself as the main vulnerability of UKIP as far as PR went. It got to the point that the party's leader at the time straight up walked out during an interview when this topic was brought up.
That kind of comment, though, has prompted some concerns.
How many times are you going to ask me the
voters?
same question? How many times are you going to ask me the same question? Thank you very much.
All of this is basically because Sargon was just big enough to have some degree of mainstream relevance, but small enough that people weren't that familiar with his content. Additionally, a lot of these statements were lost in the middle of long streams, meaning an enemy of his was very unlikely to ever find out about them, since you'd have to listen to him talk for hours in order to get the juicy stuff. However, the juicy stuff was definitely seen as quite juicy to journalists.
In another section of the video, Mr. Benjamin uses racial slurs.
So, off. It's okay for me to call you this because racism is power plus prejudice.
There are other sections of this video which we can't show you because they are too offensive.
Personally, I find racist jokes funny.
You have a video where you call Chinese people
Yes.
and by all accounts, that
because
is racist.
Words have meaning, and you don't know what the meaning of that word was. You don't know what the context was, what the narrative of it is. That's the point.
It's broadly accepted as a racist term.
Yeah, I know. That's why I used it.
As astounding as it may be to see how unapologetic he was throughout this whole ordeal, realistically, these are the kind of comments you can defend if you're a YouTuber, just not if you're a politician. The remarks he made about Jess Phillips actually got Sargon under investigation by the police, and I'm not even sure what they were investigating. His ability, or lack thereof, to go guerrilla mode? In any event, multiple members of UKIP didn't like where this was heading and left the party entirely. Eventually, they lost up to 80% of their seats, which put Sargon on DEFCON 1 as he scrambled to promote his campaign as much as possible. However, his infamy preceded him wherever he went, as he had a hard time being in any crowd of people without getting milkshaked. In one instance, someone even cartoonishly threw a fish at him. To put it bluntly, UKIP was cooked. Come election day, the party got a measly 3.3% of the vote, becoming the second least voted for party in the running. Neither Sargon nor Count Dankula managed to get a seat in parliament. Now, while Sargon wasn't helping UKIP stay afloat whatsoever, it probably would have fallen apart on its own, since that kind of thing happens in politics all the time for a variety of reasons. For example, a lot of people who supported the party were simply attached to Nigel Farage, and when he left, so did they. Regardless, this spelled the end of Sargon's short-lived political career, as if he ever tried to pursue anything similar ever again, the media would have more than enough ammo to just run the exact same train on his public perception. But this wasn't the only bad thing happening to Sargon at the time. His Twitter account got banned while he was still running for office, and his main channel was demonetized due to the guerrilla mode remarks. Consequently, the uploads to it dwindled as he started posting daily on an alternate account, a COD Daily, though his audience was a shell of what it once was. He was still making a very decent amount of money on Subscribestar, where he had well over 2,000 subscribers by the end of 2019. But if his objective was to be a voice of reason in the sphere of culture and politics, that possibility was long gone. In 2020, he became a member of a project called Hearts of Oak, which was supposed to be an up-and-coming alternative news site, but like many alt social media startups, it never really went anywhere. One of the last fruits of his all but completely gone mainstream relevance as a political commentator manifested in the form of a ruling in the Aquila Obviously case, which went unequivocally in Sargon's favor. He wisely countersued Aquila immediately, and though that did drag the case on for another half a year, in August 2020, he was awarded almost $40,000 to recoup his lawyer fees. Given he'd paid for those lawyer fees with money donated by his fans through a GoFundMe page, but regardless, her lawsuit being frivolous meant she would have to cough up the 38 grand. Aquila did not embrace her loss gracefully. For the past 4 years, this person has made racist and sexist harassing content about me and other black content creators for the purpose of getting his followers to harass us. He was banned from VidCon when they forged badges and yelled over us on panels. Then Carl Benjamin, the person I'm referring to, ran for office in England and was so repugnant, he said his female opponent was too ugly for him to rape her. The judge decided to throw out my case. Then in March, the very same white supremacist decided to countersue for legal fees because I responded to one of those little boys harassing me by calling him a racist. He claimed my case was, therefore, never about copyright infringement. So today, I found out that because I responded to a racist on Twitter, I am expected to pay this man, who is incredibly racist and terrible, $38,000 because I responded to racism directed at me. She closed off the thread by showing the full name of the judge who threw out her case, despite the fact that she admitted her lawyer screwed up the initial filing that caused Sargon to win it so easily. She also brought up his GoFundMe, which raised over $120,000, suggesting she'd countersue to get it, though I very much doubt that will ever happen. While some of her own fans showed support, the rant was met with plenty of mockery as well, and the whole case was largely seen as a positive for the YouTube platform, since it set a precedent for what was considered transformative and showed that, for the first time in a long while, it wasn't blindly punishing anyone right-wing. Besides Aquila, there was one other public person randomly mauling about Sargon, author Mike Brooks, who wrote a novel taking place in the Warhammer 40k universe. In the story, there was an orcish slave master called Sargon a God, an obvious reference to Sargon. While it was very much intended to be an own, for one, it was silly that this guy's way of calling Sargon out was to create a meanie character and name it after him. Secondly, as Sargon pointed out, this just meant he was now a part of the canon, an overall W. Around the same time, he also launched his new endeavor, the Lotus Eaters. While it was initially supposed to be a multimedia website, it eventually focused its efforts on a podcast format, which became relatively successful with over 400,000 subs and over 250 million views. While the relevance he once had in the mid-2010s was long gone, Sargon was still doing well for himself, got married, and had 2 kids. He hasn't completely abandoned his online presence and political stance, and occasionally still uploads to the Sargon channel, but he struck a healthy balance between it and his personal life. I've been Turkey Tom, thanks for watching, and until next time, leave me alone.